Hey guys, this is Manga here with a new video, and this video is going to be me giving tips on how to name your characters, and I'm going to be giving 16 tips. Now, as most of you know, there are several videos on YouTube or just articles on the internet that kind of give tips as well. So some of the things that I would say would be things that, might be me just echoing what someone else has said, because even I myself have done the research. So even before watching this video, I recommend you do kind of research on your own, then you can come back or do it after you watch this video. And people have made this videos like this, like Cracked, Mark Crilly, certain writers on YouTube that might not be comic oriented but more like novels or novellas or things like that. And most of the things I'll say would be very similar to what they've said, or damn near the same at some points. But I get the comments where people want to know my thoughts and know what I think and the tips that I can bring to the table, which I can say things that I can bring things or let you guys know about things, give tips that I feel that no one else has really hammered on, or just things that are applicable to me, things that I use in my style. So I still feel that this video is valid, and you can learn some new stuff and you can get some new tips that you might like and you might apply to your own stories. So starting off with our first tip here, and by the way, as we're going on with this video, I'm going to be working on an Apple Black page. For those who don't know me, I'm the creator of Apple Black. You can learn everything you need to know about Apple Black. Apple Black is basically a comic/manga, and you can read the first 4 chapters free online. I'll leave links in the description. Or you can purchase volume 1 with the first 9 chapters, and you can also learn about where Apple Black is being published, Saturday AM. So all the links you could possibly need are in the description below, along with social media. And if you have questions, you can also leave them in the comment section below. So that is if you're new to this channel. If you're not, you probably know about all this stuff already. So yeah, into the video. The first tip I can give you guys is Easter eggs. Easter eggs are usually something that is kind of unexpected or undocumented that can be within, whatever piece, whatever. Easter eggs kind of apply to everything, just not just comics or anything that has to do with storytelling. It could be a video game, it could be even damn textbooks, anything really. And they're kind of little clues or nods to your audience that hint at something else, or reveal something else, or is just some kind of extra information, something along that lines that create the audience might be familiar with and understand. Sometimes it can actually be something that pushes the story forward, so it could be used to reveal things at times. It could be used as twists or cliffhangers once the reader kind of notices it. But there are certain times where it's never noticed throughout the whole series or video game. No one ever notices it. Or sometimes it is similar to like cheat codes, where you can finish a game without cheat codes. Or you watch like Iron Man 1, and you kind of see the Captain America shield in the background. Most of you know what Easter eggs are anyway. I have no idea why I'm explaining this. But you can also have that be like put it in names. So jumping into, like, for instance, it could just be a name that's referencing something else. It could be a name that for instance, porn stars, right? Bear with me here. There's this thing where porn stars kind of name themselves, that I've heard, that they'll name themselves, say after their first name will be their pet, and their last name would be the street of their childhood home or something like that. And if I was a porn star, my name would be Jackie Festac. So yeah, that's one tip. One tip is make your character a porn star for a second so you can name him. But that's kind of like an Easter. That can kind of be seen as an Easter egg. Another thing would be an Easter egg is where things like Deadpool, where some of the streets were named after the creators of the project, or things like that. So basically, you can name your characters as Easter. They could be Easter egg kind of names where they don't really mean anything, or maybe they don't necessarily mean anything. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe the audience notices it, maybe the audience doesn't. But I'll be giving more examples of Easter egg kind of names as we move forward in this video. You can have a name that can be an anagram. So an anagram is basically a word or phrase. I'm using like Google definition here just to make it simple. A word, phrase, or name formed by rearranging the letters of another, such as cinema formed from Iceman, right? So you can have things like that where the names can they could even have like double meanings when you switch them around. So a quick example I could give would be Tom Riddle from Harry Potter, from the Harry Potter franchise, from the Harry Potter series, where there is like a middle name in there, and once you Tom something Riddle, you can leave in the comments what it actually is. I'm sure there's some Harry Potter heads, Harry Potheads in the comments. See, that's a good name right there, Potheads. Anyways, moving on. What the full name is, and when you switch it around, I think they did this in the second film, Chamber of Secrets, where you flip the names around and it spells out I am Lord Voldemort or something like that. So it doesn't even always, you could play around with anagrams to where it doesn't actually, they could be a sentence. It could be like a name that will be switched into a sentence or a phrase or a saying or something like that. And it also it's kind of like an Easter egg in the sense that people who have known the name Tom Riddle, not tying it to Voldemort, now you can see the tie-in where it's not just an Easter egg, it's not just some random Easter egg. It actually pushes the story forward to where it's kind of like a clue that's been in your face the whole time. Another example would be Neo from The Matrix, where it's Neo, but you know how throughout the series you kind of are trying to figure out whether he's the one or not. Sometimes you can even use these anagrams to be a little misleading, where it says Neo, but it's an anagram for one, right? Which Morpheus is always like, oh, you're the one, and you're the one. If you've ever seen The Matrix, you know what I'm talking about. Even though at the end of the day, there are theories out there that I believe that Neo's actually not the one, it's actually Agent Smith, but that's a video for another time. Point is, Neo, one anagram. A little spoiler here, not too big of a spoiler, I'm not going to give everything away, but for my series Apple Black, the main lead, Sano, actually takes a couple tips from this video. Not takes, because I'm the one giving tips anyways, but the Sano is actually also an anagram. Obviously not just Sano, the full name, Sano Bengote Tamashi, is actually an anagram for something else, which I'm not gonna give that away, but my point is, even I use some of these tips as well. The third tip here would be where you're naming the character based off of some reference, where you're referencing something else, or you're doing it in honor of something else, or it's just from your experience. So sometimes naming the character, you might not be referencing anything within the series, so it might not be an Easter egg in that sense, but it could be maybe you naming a character after your friend, maybe maybe the character is actually based off of your friend or things like that. So sometimes it could be personal, is what I'm saying, or it maybe not, but just referencing something. It could be anything. It's up to you, it's up to the series, it's up to what you feel works or not. An example I would give would be Caesar in my series Apple Black, where Caesar is kind of like referencing this Julius Caesar, where even most characters that are named Caesar sometimes are in some ways leaders of some revolution, or just rulers or leaders or generals, something in some form of authority in some way. Not all the time, but sometimes. So you have the characters based off of, the character is not based off of, but the name is kind of like in reference to. So just kind of nodding at the similarities where that they have, because Caesar in Apple Black is a prince. So there, so you can name your characters that way as well. Another example would, getting your names from references. There isn't one way to do it. There are many ways to do it. That it could be maybe the first letter in the character's name, the first name, and the first letters of the first name and the last name could be referencing something else. So for example, I could give like characters that are named, say, John Connor, right, where their first initials are JC, and there will be maybe some tie-in to what makes John Connor similar to Jesus Christ, because most times the reference is to Jesus, and in most cases the characters end up sacrificing something about themselves, sacrificing something for the greater good, right? Kind of like how Jesus did. Or you have a character, say John Carpenter, who that was played by Keanu Reeves in The Day the World Stood Still, and even the word carpenter is also a reference as well, where stories of Jesus being a carpenter. Same thing when the character has the name Shepherd in it, is also most times is also a reference to Jesus, or just a reference to the kind of character the person may be, where it may not be an actual shepherd, right? But the character might be someone who leads people in some way, where he leads a flock of sheep, right? And the sheep could be metaphorical for the group of his people. An example would be, say, Bray Wyatt in WWE, even though his name is not Shepherd, but if the character was called Shepherd, it'll make a lot of sense. But it might have been too on the nose, so sometimes people stay away from that. Another thing is where you have a character that's a JC or a Shepherd, but they're a villain, and most times those guys are just the complete opposite, kind of like the Antichrist. So that could be what the reference is in that scenario. You can even have it where maybe if the person is very evil or very opposite from what JC would usually reference, you can have that person's initials be a CJ. I'm just playing around. That's not always the case. This is not like a norm. Most of these it doesn't mean like there are instances where this doesn't follow. Again, these are just tips, right? Not everybody follows these, so this is not foolproof, right? But these are just ways that you can reference or use reference to name your characters. The fourth tip would be for you to pay attention to like sound and how the name sounds. So going back to Caesar, that Z, and also the way I spell it is spelled differently, so I don't spell it with an S, I spell it with a Z. So that's a tip I was going to get to, but I'll get to it when I get to it, where you can kind of fool around with spellings, right? So these tips are things where you can mix and match, right? You don't need to just follow one and stick with that. Mix and match, kind of feel things out based off of your series, based off of you, what you think works, you being honest with yourself, so you can kind of mix things and all of that. So you want to kind of pay attention to the sound and how things sound. So there's a character called Lily, and Lily, when I hear that name, I'm kind of I kind of think of something pure or just fun and just free, you know what I mean? Think of flowers and so you kind of play around with the sound and the feeling and things like that, and you can use that to name your characters. I wouldn't necessarily name a character that maybe is some big boss demon killer villain and I'll name him Lily, you know what I mean? But if it's like a comedy series or something, you're just trying to you're kind of making fun of the tropes or making fun of the rules or whatever, you can break these rules, which is another tip that I'll get to, so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But these are things to keep in mind as well when you're naming your characters. So the fifth tip is the same, similar, right? Where you're kind of feeling the name out. You want to also, in this way, the reason why I'm separating it, because here I'm kind of focusing more on, say, the era of your story. So if your story is kind of taking place in like a real world or real time, where it's not too much in the distant past and not too much in the distant future, or maybe it is. It's really up to you. But really, I'm talking about if you say your character was the setting of your story takes place in the Victorian era. You kind of want names. You kind of want to go through that whole sounding process and all the other tips that I've mentioned prior, as well as the sounding names within that Victorian era that makes the character fit into that era. So sometimes you name your character based off of the setting of the story. And from here we kind of dive into tip 6, which ties in with everything, where you can also look up names. There are lots of sites that even some baby name sites, I can you can just easily just Google baby names or just names, which are just names anyways. They will give you the names. Not only give you names in alphabetical order, they also give you the meaning. So you're kind of looking up names, kind of keeping in mind what they mean, keeping in mind how they sound and the feeling you get from them. So you can look up names and you can pick names from there. You can use that method and also make sure it fits the character you're giving the name to, fits what you're trying to build, and fits the setting of your work. And if it's like if it's not too alternate universe or completely fictional place, and it's more grounded, you can pick. There are lots of sites that have those kind of names. If not, then you end up you probably have to make up names, which I also have tips for, by the way. So when it comes to creating fictional names, you also want to think in the same style, because you're now creating a world from scratch. So that world will have its own eras, it will have its own tribes and clans and families and whatever, and groups, right? And you kind of want to name names that kind of fit in with each group. Game of Thrones, right? You have, for those who pay attention, who watch Game of Thrones, I don't know if you guys actually watch Game of Thrones. Good show, by the way, I recommend it. They're a group of people, Targaryens, right? And there is a style in the spellings of the names. There's a style in the way they sound. Daenerys, Viserys, Varys, Rhaegar. Sometimes they do like where you spell things, like for instance Rhaegar is kind of RHAEGAR, you know what I mean? And you have like Daenerys, and Daenerys is, I think, is the same DAE, and the Riss, the way the Y's all in the names, where the names all have that same feel. So sometimes you might actually want to name your characters in that sense, and these names also have this you also want to pay attention to the feeling as well, because all these names have like a similar feel, in addition to having a royal, rich, fruitful kind of vibe, right? That is kind of maintained throughout for all the characters within that group, within that Targaryen group, right? And then you go into something like the Starks, and the names are very different, right? So the names kind of fit for Starks, right? You have Ned, Jon, like they're very Bran, where they're just very almost simple and bland, and so they kind of give off that simple man vibe, right? So those are things you want to keep in mind as well when you're coming up with fictional names, where the names are kind of grouped. And if it's a series where there is only one group within that world, then you kind of want to name, right? Everybody in the series will kind of have names that would feel not necessarily the same. I mean, you can have a name that's within the group, but one name could feel more menacing than the other, right? So there's a lot of leeway when it comes to fictional names. It's just up to you to kind of feel things out and come up with something fresh. Another example would be, say, there would be a tribe in Apple Black where all the characters from that tribe, all the names from that tribe are kind of inspired by, say, maybe an African tribe that I know in real life. I might actually, I might end up playing around with the spellings here and there for another reason, which I'll get to. But I might end up playing around with the names, but they're all derived from that tribe in Africa, so they'll all the names will have this African sound, right? But that doesn't mean they'll all have the same feel, but at least they will be grouped in that way. Also take into account that Apple Black itself has lots of groups within it, right? There is no Japan or America or Nigeria in Apple Black, but there are places that might be inspired by things out of my head, or real places and real cultures and history that I have experienced, or I've have some knowledge on, or some things that I've done research on. So the groups within Apple Black might be based off of other things, right? But the groups, so within Apple Black there'll be all sorts of names, but they'll all be kind of grouped, and those groups might be inspired by things completely fictional or things that exist. Another method of coming up with names, fictional names, or any kind of name, is where you're kind of altering little things about already existing names of objects or occupations or things like that to come up with the name. Where you can have, say, there are lots of So there's some series where maybe characters will have code names, and maybe they will only be known by their code names in the series, which is another thing. You don't always have to have a name, where the character could just have a code name and that could be it. Or there are even instances where characters don't even have names, or their names are never mentioned in the series. And for example would be say Fight Club, where there's some people who argue maybe his name is Jack, but there are others who argue where he doesn't really have a name and he just calls himself Jack and is mostly referenced as the narrator throughout the Fight Club movie. There are lots of cool code names. Most code names are cool anyways. You can have, and it could just be anything really. It could be a name where sometimes I see when they'll just add an S at the end of at the end of the title, say a bottle, and a character's name will be Bottles, or a Bubble. I put an S, Bubbles. A character could just be called Church or Soaps. Volks, where they switch. Maybe the character has something to do with electricity and getting. Maybe the character has like powers that have to do with electricity, volts and all of that, but instead of with a T, you spell it with a K, and the characters could be called Volks or things. Well, I have a character called Volks, so kind of letting you guys know how the name came about. So you kind of have that freedom to play around with words and still keep in mind what we discussed earlier about the sound and the feeling you get from the name itself. Some examples I can give are where the series Hero, where there's literally a character in there called Hero, but different spelling, where it's Hiro, but that's also Japanese, so it kind of plays well into their favor because the character is also Japanese, so it kind of worked perfectly. But the name of the show is Hero, the character's name is Hero, you know what I mean? So that could also be a way you name a character. And the character also kind of fit the character as well, because he kind of encapsulated what it meant to be a hero. There are several instances where he did what a hero would do and sacrifice himself in certain scenarios and la 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 la. If you watch the series, you know what I'm talking about. Another example would be maybe when you're putting names together, you're just mashing names together. We could look at the Pokemon series, and we have Squirtle. Squirtle is basically a turtle with a squirrel tail and squirts water at you. Put it all together: turtle, squirrel, squirts, Squirtle. The ninth tip would be spellings, where you would it'll be in your best interest to kind of name or spell the characters' names according to how they're pronounced, so that it's easier for readers or people who see the name, easier for them to pronounce the name. And when they pronounce it correctly, or rather than pronouncing it in some weird fashion. You can also rename, play around with the spellings of the name for many other reasons, especially if the world is a fictional world, where you have a lot of leeway to do that. But if say it's not, you can still, there's certain instances where you would want to play around with the spellings of actual names that maybe people already know how to spell it in one way, where you can spell it a different way for whatever reason. But there are certain reasons why you would spell things differently, and even in the world as is, there are names that aren't always spelled the same. Sometimes you spell John without a H, or there's instances where Peter is spelled P-E-T-R, and that's all kind of based off of where the names are derived from, where the person's from, and things like that. So you kind of want to keep that in mind as well. But for the most part, if it's a fictional world that you're coming up with, it's also always in your best interest to kind of spell the character's name in a way that it's easy for audiences to pronounce. And then there are some other times where you play around with the spelling because it fits the world that you're in. So for instance, when you hear, going back to the Game of Thrones thing, where you hear Daenerys, that risk, you already know it's a Y, because that's how, that's just how Game of Thrones rolls, basically, right? So another instance would be in Apple Black as well, where character Simon is not spelled S-I-M-O-N, is spelled S-Y-M-O-N. Still the same pronunciation, but that's just how things are done in my fictional Apple Black world. Or things where the character's name might end with an I, where normally it will be spelled with one I, but I'll spell it with two. For instance, Tamashi or Weeworth. There's the character named Weeworth in Apple Black. If you read Apple Black, you know what I'm talking about. So that's kind of like a thing. So it could also be a reoccurring theme how you spell things. And sometimes if you do it enough, your audience will kind of pick on it. And even when, say, you just mentioned the name, they'd be able to spell it how you would spell it in your world. The 10th tip would be, sometimes you want memorable names. You want names that your audience or your readers would be able to remember easily, and you can either pay attention to this, maybe playing around with the syllables. You kind of maybe don't want names that have too many syllables, because that way they'd be harder to spell, they'd be harder to pronounce, they'd be harder to remember, and things like that. That's why you see most main characters in series always have at most three syllables in their name. Sometimes if it's more than that, then the character usually has like a short name, a nickname, or just a short version of the name. So for instance would be Goku, just 2 syllables. Luffy, 2 syllables, memorable names. Ichigo, Naruto, 3 syllables. And this doesn't just apply to main characters, it just applies to, the characters with memorable names. Or just a tip, something to keep in mind. It's just like an extra thing there, where you want to pay attention to syllables and the simplicity of how things sound and feel and all that jazz, all the things that we've kind of discussed prior. But in my experience, I imagine that the more syllables, the harder it is to spell. The longer the name, the more not memorable it is, if that's an actual word. There are instances where you can, I break this rule sometimes. It's not really a rule, but I don't do this sometimes, especially for last names, where maybe I want the last name to give a certain vibe, a certain menacing feel, or maybe the last name has a meaning. The last name has a literal translation, and that because of the translation, the name is actually because of the translation, the name is actually much longer than it would have been, and I'm just kind of keeping that regardless. Which brings us to our next tip. Sometimes you might want to research these names, kind of like going back to what I said before, where you go to these sites with all these names, and you've kind of picked where the name you want the names to be from, how they want to be grouped and all that jazz. But when you see all these names, kind of paying attention to what they mean, and what the feel and the vibe and all that stuff, and what the names are usually associated with. So for instance, like there are names that most villains, right, would have. Well, not most villains, but paying attention to the characters whose names kind of start with a mal, where a mal kind of means, like for Spanish, malo. I think malo means bad. I'm sorry, my Spanish is not the greatest right now, but malo means bad, or mal in Latin kind of translates to bad in some way. There's something like that, right? And you see characters like Maleficent, you see characters like Malfoy's from the Harry Potter series, or Malekith from Thor, and also referencing those kind of names where they're usually bad guys. Now, again, you can play around with these, you can break these rules and give it to a good guy, or maybe a bad guy turned good guy, or something like that. And these are things that I even researched myself, where even some other videos on YouTube as well kind of talk about this. Like I said, the cracked video that goes over names also mentions this. So yeah, you kind of want to research names. Sometimes you kind of research what they're associated with, because you might want to name a character something, and you wouldn't know that that name is associated with something that associated with a vibe that you're not necessarily going for. So you kind of want to pay attention to that sometimes when you're naming your characters. This also leads into the next tip, which would be kind of knowing the meaning of the names, right? And it also ties into the research. So knowing the meaning of the names that you're picking before you pick them, just so you know. I also want to keep in mind that you don't want to spend too much time on stuff like this, where sometimes the meaning of the name is not nearly as important as the character itself, or what the character does, or the story as a whole, right? So you don't want to spend too much time on this kind of stuff. I mean, they're important, right? They're important, but just not as important as some other things, so don't stress out too much. And that's basically the 14th tip. They're important, right? The naming stuff is important, but just not as important as the core things that matter most. and that's the plot, the story, however, how the storytelling and the character itself, you know, what makes the character interesting and stuff like that. This next tip is also one that Mr. Crilly mentions in his video as well. Is you kind of want to keep in mind that just in case if you're talking about, most times it's the main character or sometimes it's the villain or something like that, where the name could also be the name of the title, name of the series itself. So you also want to pay attention to that, and I think that will be a different video I'll go into, where you want to where you're trying to come up with names for your series or your story. And I guess one tip for that would be to use a character's name, an important character's name, or a character that ties into something that's important. For instance, Zelda, right? But even though the main character isn't Zelda, but Zelda is an example, right? Naruto is an example. They're examples. You know what I'm talking about. Harry Potter is an example, right? So sometimes you also want to keep in mind your character's name. It might be still up to you, be the title of your series. So you also want so bear in mind that you're not just naming the character, you're naming your series, and naming your series is really important, because that's like what people remember. That's what people see first if they want to, you know, keep track of what series it is, and maybe you want to research it later. You kind of want a catchy name, so you end up wanting a catchy name for the series and the character itself. It's more. It goes in. There's more to it than that. But you know, that's all I'm going to say for now. I think naming your series, coming up with a name for your series, is a separate video on its own. Which brings me to my final tip, which would be there are no rules. You can basically you don't have to follow all of this, right? And you know, sometimes during this video like that, I think I even rambled a little bit, but you don't have to follow these rules. There are no rules. You kind of it's always good to know them, at least kind of knowing the rules before you can break the rules. It's always good to know the rules before you can break them, but you don't have to follow these rules, but it's always good to know. Another thing would be you can mix and match. I mean, you know, you don't necessarily have to only use one of the tips. You can kind of mix and match with several of the tips, as well as breaking some of them and still using some of them as is and things like that. You have a lot of freedom. You're the creator, you're the artist, you're the one that's going to have to be creative. You know what I mean? So that's pretty much it. Okay guys, that is all for this video. Sorry the video was this long, but I haven't done a long video like this in a while. And this video, yeah, I'm giving my tips, but it's also kind of like a discussion, so you guys can leave the names of your characters in the description below. Even if you don't have a story, maybe what you would name your main protagonist or antagonist. That's basically heroes or villains or whatever, or names that you guys find interesting and why. You can leave in the comments below, and I'll be reading a couple of them. Also, if you have questions, other tips that I might have missed, you can also leave them in the comments below, and you know, if I find them interesting, we can have like a discussion in the comments as well. So yeah, just anything name related or whatever. I'd like to thank you guys for watching the video. I know it was kind of long, and you know, watching it to the end. I'd like to thank everyone. And if you haven't checked out Apple Black already, please do so. For those who have purchased Volume 1, a big thank you to you guys. You guys kind of opened some doors, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'd like to thank everyone who's supported Apple Black in any way, or any other projects that I'm involved with, including Saturday AM. You guys can check out Apple Black at Saturday AM. All the links you could possibly need are in the description, in the description of this video, and all the links you could possibly need as well, including links to my social media or the important Saturday AM social media as well. Don't forget to like this video, because that also helps a great deal, and subscribe if you haven't already. It's been great talk, a long one. Hope you guys enjoyed the visuals, and that'll be that. Apple Black Volume 2 should be out this December, so y'all should stay tuned for that. I'm gonna try and do some big things for that, maybe even get like big YouTubers to kind of review the books and stuff like that. But you know, discussion for another time. It's White Manga, and I'm outie.